Donald Trump's first appearance at the UN General Assembly on Tuesday has drawn widespread criticism for his bellicose rhetoric towards the DPRK. Has he actually made matters worse in an already difficult situation? And as Singapore's Prime Minister wraps up his three-day visit to China, I'll be asking whether Sino-Singaporean relations have had a boost by this visit. Welcome to The Point. Live from Beijing, I'm Hsien. September 19th marked U.S. President Donald Trump's debut in the 72nd United Nations General Assembly, and DPRK's nuclear program was undoubtedly a main focus of the meeting. During his speech, President Trump referred to DPRK leader Kim Jong Un as the rocket man and threatened to totally destroy North Korea to defend the U.S. and its allies if it is left with no choice. In response, DPRK's Foreign Minister Yong said, "Even when dogs bark, the caravan goes on." Has Trump's lack of diplomacy exacerbated the already difficult situation? Is there still any room left for a peaceful solution to the DPRK nuclear issue? To discuss this, I'm joined in Beijing by Dr. Zhao Tong, a research fellow at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy, and by Dr. Zach Cooper, a senior fellow for Asian Securities at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Welcome, gentlemen, to the show. Dr. Cooper, first to you. Now, CNN has called President Trump's debut at the UNGA a blueprint for global Trumpism. Do you agree? What do you think of his debut?
Well, certainly he was trying to outline what an America First policy might look like. I still think we won't know for some number of months until he releases a national security strategy that actually outlines exactly how he's going to accomplish the objectives he set forth at the United Nations. But there's no question that this was a very different speech than the kinds of speeches we've heard from President Trump's predecessors.
What kind of differences have you observed? Dr. Cooper. Dr. Cooper,
I'm sorry, say that again?
Yeah, Dr. Cooper, I was just asking you because you said this is a very different speech from his predecessors. What kind of major differences can you notice? Do you hear me? Okay, let me come to Dr. Cooper in just a moment, to Mr. Zhao here. What do you think of the debut of President Trump at the UN here? Some people are calling that an embarrassment to the United States. What's your take?
I think he's advocate for America First policy principle. His advocate for nationalistic foreign policy is really having a negative impact. Just imagine, his American First statement was translated into multiple languages to the audiences in the room. What impact would that have for the audience? I don't think people in the room would be optimistic for American foreign policy going forward. That doesn't send a good signal. It doesn't represent American leadership in the liberal world. So I'm a little concerned about how that will implicate for American policy for the rest of Mr. Trump's administration.
Yeah, especially talking about the DPRK nuclear issue, which is your research field. Now, President Trump called Kim Jong Un the rocket man and threatened to wipe out his country if the U.S. is left without choice. Is this just another threat or a real signal, you think, that the U.S. is running out of patience towards that country?
I think clearly the United States is running out of patience. But again, I don't see the United States at this moment willing to take the unimaginable option of initiating a military strike against DPRK. As multiple senior White House officials have indicated, the military option is always there, but they still prefer diplomacy. But I think Mr. Trump actually sent a very dangerous signal to DPRK. Of course, he wants to deter DPRK from using nuclear weapons, but he also threatened to completely wipe out the country with the 25 million people in that area. So in order for deterrence to work, of course, Trump has to threaten North Korea with the consequences of retaliation. But he also, he also needs to reassure that if North Korea does not attack the United States wouldn't attack North Korea preemptively. But Mr. Trump failed to deliver that message of reassurance, so that removes incentives for North Korea to be self-restrained.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Cooper, let's try this again. Now, President Trump said that, if necessary, the U.S. will totally destroy the DPRK. However, this is not the first time that similar rhetoric is used in the history of this conflict. For instance, former U.S. President Bill Clinton, if my recollection is correct, also said similar things, that if the DPRK ever possess nuclear weapon, they will face a very similar consequence as well. Do you think these two rhetorics are different in any way? If so, what is special about Mr. Trump's threats this time?
Well, there's no question that President Trump has been much more direct and in describing the threats to the United States from North Korea, and that he has been serious about threatening these kinds of very serious retaliatory actions. On the other hand, I think your other guest is right that the chances of a real conflict, at least in the near term, are actually quite low. The United States, I think, was mainly trying to reassure South Korea and Japan that it would act on their behalf if North Korea attacked either one of them. So the president's comments certainly are much more colorful than what we've heard from other U.S. leaders, but I think in many ways they're along the lines of long-standing U.S. policy.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Cooper, now before President Donald Trump's speech, DPRK ambassador left the assembly, leaving only one lower-level official representative staying in the room. You think there is still, given the kind of rhetoric and exchange of fiery rhetoric from both sides and the latest nuclear test by the DPRK, do you think there is still any room left for the U.S. and DPRK to come back to the negotiating table, or have they both passed the point of no return?
Well, I don't think that North Korea really intends to give up its nuclear or its missile program. So I doubt that negotiations would be successful in that regard. Now, whether it might be possible to solidify the armistice that ended the Korean War, that may be another question. But I think Washington is slowly giving up hope on getting rid of North Korea's nuclear and missile programs, and instead what it's trying to do is to contain and deter North Korea and really close the economic loopholes that have allowed North Korea to continue trading with the international economy.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Zhao, DPRK's first response to President Trump's speech was even when dogs bark, the caravan goes on. Has President Trump made matters worse? Had he actually underlined Kim Jong Un's reasons not to get rid of his nukes?
I think so. I think his rhetoric is making the matters worse. Even though Secretary of State Rex Tillerson previously repeatedly reassured North Korea that the United States has no intention to threaten the regime, Mr. Trump's statement actually undermines the credibility of that reassurance message. So from the North Korean perspective, I think they are hearing is the message that the United States is really after them, is threatening the regime regardless what North Korea is doing. So I'm afraid that this only enhances North Korea's threat perception. And as a result, North Korea has said very clearly that the American rhetorics and movements only proved that the North Korean pursuit of nuclear weapons is the right policy to go. So I think North Korea is more determined to complete the remaining technical development of their nuclear missile programs. So we are likely to see even more missile tests, such as ICBM test, or even another additional nuclear test. I think the situation will become even more volatile in the future.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Cooper, in his speech, President Trump said he will see what the UN will have to do about the DPRK, but the UN Security Council so far seems not able to do more than passing resolutions round after another, the latest being Resolution 2371 and 2375, slashing more sanctions against the DPRK. What more can the UN do realistically?
Well, I think the hope among some in Washington is that you'll see an increase in sanctions, especially on fuel oil, So I think we're at about 30% right now in terms of the sanctions on fuel oil. I think there are many in Washington who want to see that number get closer to 100%. We've recently seen North Korean diplomats getting kicked out of countries around the world. So I think there's going to be a pursuit of these types of efforts to increase the pressure on North Korea and force it back to the table. But again, I think it's unlikely that North Korea would come back to the table willing to really negotiate its nuclear and missile programs. After all, as the other guest said, these nuclear and missile programs are really the only deterrent capability that North Korea has, in addition to its pretty limited conventional capabilities.
Dr. Zhao, finally, DPRK's Foreign Minister Yong is expected to give a speech on Friday at the UNGA, and the media suspect he will try to defend to the world the legitimacy of DPRK's nuclear program. What possible response will the DPRK get?
Firstly, if we follow the recent rhetorics from Pyongyang, we will see that for more than one time, North Korea said that they are completing the final step to constituting their nuclear deterrence capabilities. So I think even though we might expect a number of additional missile tests, I think after North Korea complete these tests in a very short time, they will quickly soften their positions and quickly launch a diplomatic offensive. So I think the foreign minister of North Korea at the General Assembly of the UN would certainly try to legitimize their nuclear programs, but he would also hint at the possibility of negotiations after North Korea completes the program. So if the United States, South Korea can seize this opportunity, be prepared to engage directly with their North Korean counterpart, I think there is still hope that diplomacy can work. We can at least diffuse the current tensions and reach a near-term agreement.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Zhao Tong at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy, and to Dr. Zach Cooper at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. And here's my first point. It is often argued that UN Security Council resolutions need to be followed and sanctions need to be carried out if we are to find any solutions to this crisis. But if you take a good look at the resolutions concerning the DPRK, you'll see that they don't just call for sanctions to make their country reining its nuclear program. It also calls for genuine dialogue as a way to resolve the crisis. But this point often gets ignored or forgotten when people talk about resolutions. If there is no effort made on the part of interest parties to engage in serious conversation, then these UN resolutions simply cannot be implemented fully. To create an atmosphere conducive to talks is an important first step to resolving the crisis, but we're not seeing that happening on either side of the conflict. Name-calling, as Donald Trump was doing in the UN, is simply parole and surely has no place in serious diplomacy. If you think someone is crazy and on a suicide mission, to mock him will not help bring him back into the fold. Diplomacy has been described as the art of letting someone else have your way. Maybe this is an art form that President Trump should start to learn fast. You have been watching The Point with me, Hsien. We'll take a short break and we'll be back right after this. Prime Minister of Singapore Hsien Loong concludes his three-day China visit in Xiamen city of South China's Fujian province, where Chinese President Xi Jinping worked for more than 17 years. During his visit, Singapore and China signed a memorandum of understanding to help businesses resolve disputes under the Belt and Road Initiative and discussed cooperation potential in the Kuala Lumpur-Singapore high-speed rail. The visit has come as a welcome surprise to observers, as bilateral ties have followed a relatively bumpy path in the last year. In June last year, Singapore backed an international tribunal ruling siding with the US over the South China Sea dispute. This May, Hsien was visible by his absence, from a high-profile forum on China's Belt and Road Initiative. So what has brought about the apparent change in attitude towards closer relations with China? I'm joined in Singapore by Dr. Tang Keqiang, who is co-director of the Asia Competitiveness Institute at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in the National University of Singapore. Also in Singapore, we have Professor Rohan Mukherjee, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Yale News College. And in Manila, we have Dr. Victor Gao, Director of the China National Association of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Dr. Tan, let me come to you first. In fact, since 2012, Hsien has visited China every year, except for 2015 when he hosted Xi's state visit to Singapore. So is this meeting more of a routine one, or is this visit really to patch up deteriorating ties?
Well, I think this is a very special meeting coming at a time just before the 19th plenary meeting of China. It does reflect the special relationship that both sides treasure, and the number of top leaders that my Prime Minister have met shows that this is an important occasion to continue on with the good past tradition. If I may quote President Xi Jinping, he actually said that this special relationship worked by 2 generations and will continue to progress with the time. This shows how serious Singapore and China are looking at each other's effort to help to make Asia a more prosperous region. So I think this is something to be really appreciated. Although some will say over the last 1.5 years we have a bumpy stride or even a storm over the teacup, but I think it's important to look towards the future and think of how there are many more things that Singapore and China can do together. Like for example, the Regional Economic Cooperation or Partnership, RCEP, when Singapore will be the chairman for ASEAN 10 next year. And also we have great infrastructures development that's taking place in Asia, and it's exciting. And Singapore is a financial hub. The 33% of the foreign direct investment from China actually went through Singapore, and 85% of investment to those countries along the One Belt One Road actually went through Singapore too. So I think we can complement each other, and with China taking the leadership of globalization, which is also the core interest of Singapore. So I can see how there is a lot to be gained from both sides, and we will treasure this relationship, especially at this time that our Prime Minister so warmly welcomed, and we feel very happy too.
Professor Mukherjee, what is your take on this visit and the significance of it, also coming at a time when Prime Minister Hsien is expected to make a visit to the United States, but he chose to come to China first? What do you think is the message of the timing here?
Thank you. So I do think that in terms of the profile of the visit, as far as high-profile visits go, it doesn't get better than this. The Prime Minister met with 4 out of the 7 members of the Politburo Standing Committee, which suggested that both countries placed great importance on the visit. As far as the timing goes, it was upon the invitation of the Chinese Premier that Prime Minister Lee went to China. So we shouldn't be reading too much into that. As you already noted, there are annual visits between Singapore and China. There are high-level dialogues. There are infrastructure projects going on in various places in partnership. So there's a lot of foundational material already there for the relationship, and this was just a reaffirmation of those good ties. Having said that, it was also important, coming on the heels of, as it was noted, a year of bumpy relations. So it sort of caps that and sets a tone for the future when Singapore is going to be in the chair of the ASEAN as well in 2018. As far as the United States goes, Singapore continues to maintain its positive relations with both the United States and China. And no doubt there is some uncertainty, and the Prime Minister alluded to this in his speech regarding United States policy in Asia, which of course is of concern to all Asian countries.
Dr. Gao, when the news broke that Prime Minister Hsien would visit China, I think in the media circle and in the circle of observers, there is an apparent sign of nice surprise, right? People were happy to see that Singapore seeming to put China at the place where it should be in terms of bilateral relations with Singapore. Why is the visit so important for China?
Well, first of all, allow me to congratulate the very successful visit to China by the Singaporean Prime Minister Hsien. And I hope this important visit has helped clarify the current status of relations between China and Singapore, and also has laid the foundation for future improvement of the relations. There is strong reason for good and strong relations between China and Singapore. China has benefited from close relations from Singapore, even though Singapore is a much smaller economy. China has learned from the Singaporean experience, the management, the corporate structure, and the government's running of the economy, for example, and I think China will continue to benefit. One problem in China-Singaporean relations over the past 1 or 2 years is the tendency that Singapore used to demonstrate in terms of injecting itself in major power relations, especially between China and the United States. And I would say that for a very important small country like Singapore, the more friends it can have, the better for Singapore, and the less enemies they may have, it will be better for Singapore. It will be a recipe for disaster if Singapore chooses one side and against another side in the major power relations. And I hope Prime Minister Hsien has learned a good lesson in this process, and going forward, while firmly standing on matters of principle, Singapore hopefully will be more prudent in navigating through major power relations, especially between China and the United States.
Yeah, Dr. Gao, what you said reminds us of this article, right? This column article written by Professor Kishore Mahbubani, who is Dean and Professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the NUS, in which he argued that Qatar's experience reminds Singapore of the need for smaller states to behave itself, otherwise they have big lessons ahead of them. Dr. Tan, how do you look at the significance of all, the argument of this article, and do you think that Singapore or the Singaporean Prime Minister Hsien is following the advice of Professor Mahbubani here?
Well, I think let me clarify. It has been a long-standing policy of Singapore to have a balanced relationship with major powers. And we don't take side, and we hope major powers also do not force Singapore or any of the country in ASEAN to take side. There will be recipe for disasters. And when don't take side, when you have a balanced relationship with major power, it doesn't mean that you have the same relationship at every moment in time, but rather it is a balanced relationship over a period of time. Of course, sometimes you can be closer because of some engagement, whether it's economics or visits, but on the other time, you could be closer to another power, but over a period of time, it is a balanced relationship. And in Singapore has never tried to project ourselves as to be, whether it's middleman or trying to project too hard, but I think core interest of Singapore has always to be emphasized. As a small country, we may be small, but we need to be respected. And also we are in Southeast Asia, where I think we have to show that how we can work closely with our neighbors, with the major powers, yet without losing our ability to raise our view. I think that's very important. And if there's any misunderstanding or miscommunication of the views, I think it is very good that the both sides discuss and explore it further. But I think after all this storm over the teacup, both sides, I believe, between Singapore and China, understand each other better. It is not about small state or big state. I think it's about doing the right thing, and I think to be mutually respected. And Singapore have great respect from China. If I may say so, that instead of China learning from Singapore, I think increasingly Singapore is learning from China, like your cashless society, the e-payment, the innovation that is taking place in China. And Singapore is learning from China as well.
Sure,
so
sure. Yeah, Professor Mukherjee, let me get, great points you're making there. Let me get some perspective from Professor Mukherjee on this question, whether or not do you agree with the points that Professor Mahbubani raised in his column article. He also mentioned the importance of Singapore respecting regional organization and cherishing the United Nations. What is your take on this question?
Yeah, certainly. I think it is important to respect regional organizations as well as the United Nations, and I don't think there's any evidence that Singapore has not done those things. So that's a fairly moot point as far as it goes. As far as acting like a small state is concerned, I think Singapore has always been able to successfully balance its relationships between the great powers, and this visit in fact is evidence of that, that when there was a feeling in certain quarters that, that Singapore had gone perhaps too far in one direction, Singapore chose to correct that balance and reaffirm its relationship with China, just as it would with the United States when it goes, when the Prime Minister goes to visit in October. So I don't think there's anything wrong with maintaining that balance, and I agree with the view put forward already that Singapore has been quite good at doing that and can learn from both countries, just as both countries have learned from Singapore.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Many thanks, Professor Rohan Mukherjee, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Yale News College, Dr. Tan Ki Giab, Co-Director of the Asia Competitiveness Institute at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in the National University of Singapore, and Dr. Victor Gao, Director of the China National Association of International Studies. And here is my last point. In Chinese, there's a saying which goes, a big state needs to be benevolent and a small state needs to be wise. Now, both need to know their places in the world and behave accordingly. For small states to overplay their cards is unwise and risky. For big states not to treat others with respect, keep their promises and show the relevant responsibilities is also unacceptable. When both sides understand that reality, bilateral ties have the potential to move in the right direction. In the case of China and Singapore, after Prime Minister Hsien Loong's welcome visit to China this time, there's no reason to doubt bilateral ties are coming back to the right track. This is only going to benefit people on both sides. And that's all for this edition of The Point with me, Hsien. As always, follow me on Twitter or visit our Facebook page using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN Live to watch our show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.